It is 1752. Somewhere in Cumbria, a man is arrested for carrying a small black stone in his coat pocket. Not a jewel, not a coin. A rock, barely the size of a thumb, dug out of a hillside. Under the law of England, what he is holding is treated the same as if he'd been caught with stolen silver. The sentence for taking too much of it is transportation, shipped to the other side of the world, never to return, for a rock that at the time most of Europe couldn't even identify. This is the history of the pencil, and this is the story of how the humble pencil spent 2 centuries as one of the most tightly criminalized substances in Britain, guarded by armed men, smuggled in false-bottomed carts, and punished at times with the same severity as murder. To understand why anyone would criminalize a writing tool, you have to understand how badly the world needed one. For most of history, writing meant commitment. Scribes worked with thin rods of lead alloy dragged across papyrus or vellum, leaving a faint silvery scratch that barely qualified as legible. Artists in the Renaissance used something called silver point, a fine wire drawn across specially treated paper. Leonardo da Vinci used it. Albrecht Dürer used it. Raphael used it. It produced a beautiful, delicate line, and it had one devastating flaw. It couldn't be undone. Once the mark was on the page, it was on the page forever. There was no correcting a mistake, no second thought, no rough draft. If you wanted to sketch an idea, you had to already be sure of it. Then, somewhere in the Cumbrian fells, around 1564, according to local legend, a storm knocked over a tree, and underneath its torn-up roots was something nobody in England had ever seen. A black, heavy substance that marked the hand like charcoal, but held together like solid rock, and that, crucially, didn't burn. It wasn't coal. It wasn't lead. It was graphite, a nearly pure form of carbon, and this particular deposit at Borrowdale turned out to be the purest, most solid graphite ever found anywhere on Earth. Nothing like it existed in any other known location on the planet. Locals started using it to mark sheep, then to write. Word got out fast, because a material that lets you draw a dark, clean, erasable line was something every merchant, every mapmaker, every artist in Europe suddenly wanted. And that is exactly when the trouble started. Because the moment something becomes valuable, somebody tries to control who gets to have it. Queen Elizabeth I's government understood within a matter of years what they were sitting on. Borrowdale graphite wasn't just useful, it was militarily useful. Pure graphite was used to line the molds for cannonballs, letting iron slide free without sticking. In an age of near-constant war with Spain and France, a monopoly on the best mold-lining material in Europe was a strategic asset, not a stationary item. So the crown moved. The mine was placed under direct control. It was only permitted to operate for a handful of weeks each year, deliberately, to keep the market starved and the price astronomical. Armed guards were stationed at the site. Miners were searched on the way out. For a while, that was enough. It wasn't enough for long. Scarcity doesn't kill demand, it just makes demand more profitable, and profitable demand always finds a way through. Miners began smuggling graphite out inside hollowed loaves of bread, packed under false floors in carts, wrapped and disguised as something else entirely. Traders lined boxes with lead to throw off the weight and feel of what was really inside. The material moved quietly across the North Sea into Germany, France, and the Netherlands, where desperate pencil makers were waiting to pay almost anything for it. Prices on the black market climbed until ounce for ounce, smuggled Borrowdale graphite was worth more than most metals being traded in London, and the Crown kept tightening its grip in response. In 1752, Parliament passed a law making the theft of graphite from the mine a criminal offense, with sentences ranging up to hard labor and transportation to a penal colony for pencil lead. It sat on the books alongside laws against sheep theft and highway robbery, treated with almost identical seriousness, and still the smuggling never stopped. because the more valuable something becomes, the more people are willing to risk everything for it. And by this point in the story, the most powerful government on earth was losing a quiet, grinding war against people who simply wanted to write things down. If you're enjoying peeling back a layer of history you didn't expect from something this ordinary, that's the whole idea behind this channel. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Britain's obsession with locking down its graphite was about to collide with an entirely different kind of illegality, one born not out of greed, but out of war. By 1790, France and Britain were enemies again, this time under Napoleon Bonaparte, and Britain still controlled effectively the entire known supply of high-quality graphite on the planet. A naval blockade cut France off completely. No Borrowdale graphite could legally reach French soil, not for artists, not for merchants, and certainly not for the French army, which desperately needed pencils for maps, for engineering diagrams, for military orders that had to be legible and reliable in the field. Whatever crossed the blockade illegally wasn't enough, and wasn't nearly pure enough either. So Napoleon turned to a military scientist named Nicolas Jacques Conteau, a man who had already lost an eye in a laboratory explosion earlier in his career, and gave him an order: solve this, and solve it fast. Conte had 6 days. What he came up with didn't just work around the blockade, it made the entire British monopoly obsolete overnight. Conte took low-grade graphite, the kind nobody thought was usable, ground it into a fine powder, mixed it with clay, and fired the mixture in a kiln. The result could be shaped into rods, encased in wood, and it wrote beautifully. More than that, by adjusting the ratio of clay to graphite, he discovered you could control exactly how hard or soft, how light or dark the resulting pencil would be. That's the origin of the hardness scale still stamped on pencils today: the 2H, the HB, the 4B. Conte patented the process in 1795, and in a single stroke, 2.5 centuries of British graphite smuggling, criminal law, armed guards, and penal sentences became almost irrelevant. You no longer needed to steal pure graphite from a hillside in Cumbria. You could manufacture something just as good out of dust and clay. The most heavily guarded substance in England had just been quietly out-engineered by a one-eyed soldier working under a deadline. Britain's legal war over graphite wasn't the only one being fought either. Over in Nuremberg, Germany, the pencil trade had its own set of rules, just as rigid, just enforced by guilds instead of parliament. German pencil making was split by law between 2 separate trades. Lead cutters were permitted to shape the graphite core. Carpenters were permitted to build the wooden casing around it. Crossing that line, doing both yourself, was against guild regulation, full stop. A craftsman named Friedrich Stettler ignored it anyway. He built pencils from raw material to finished product entirely on his own, in direct violation of the guild system that governed his industry, and the guilds fought him over it for years. He kept going regardless. His name is still printed on pencils sold today, even though almost nobody buying one knows he spent years technically breaking the law to make it. America had its own strange detour through this story, and it came from a man better known for walking into the woods than for chemistry. Henry David Thoreau worked in his family's pencil factory in Concord, Massachusetts, years before he ever set foot at Walden Pond, and American pencils at the time had a real problem. Domestic graphite was plentiful but impure, and it smudged badly compared to European pencils. Thoreau studied the issue seriously, spent time researching at Harvard, and independently landed on essentially the same clay and graphite formula Conte had patented decades earlier in France. The Thoreau pencil factory became the best in America almost overnight. And then Thoreau simply walked away from it. He said once he'd solved the problem, there was nothing left in it that interested him. There were other things to think about, and to write, of course, with a pencil. One more piece of this story belongs in a courtroom, rather than a hillside or a battlefield. For most of the pencil's history, the eraser was its own separate object entirely, a lump of rubber or a chunk of stale bread kept somewhere else on your desk. In 1858, a Philadelphia stationer named Hyman Lipman had the idea of simply attaching a rubber eraser to the end of a pencil. He patented it and later sold that patent for $100,000, a genuinely staggering sum for the time. The man who bought it tried to sue a rival manufacturer for infringement, and the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court ruled against him. Combining two things that already existed, joining a known eraser to a known pencil, did not count as a new invention under patent law. The patent was invalidated. The buyer lost his fortune, and the eraser-tipped pencil kept right on existing anyway, legally unprotected, freely copied, and eventually standard on almost every pencil manufactured in America. From there, the story settles into something closer to ordinary industry. Joseph Dixon, a Massachusetts inventor obsessed with graphite for uses far beyond pencils, crucibles for steel furnaces, lubricants for machinery, built the first truly industrial pencil factory in the United States after the Civil War. Machines that could cut, shape, and finish tens of thousands of pencils a day. Dixon didn't live to see what his company built next. In 1873, it introduced a new line named after graphite mines near Lake Champlain, a place called Ticonderoga. Yellow paint arrived in 1913. The green and yellow band followed not long after. And the pencil that had once required parliamentary law, armed guards, and the threat of transportation to protect a single hillside in Cumbria became something you could buy for a few cents in any classroom in America. Somewhere around 14 billion pencils are manufactured every year now. Every single one uses some version of the formula a one-eyed French soldier worked out in 6 days under military pressure, built specifically to make a British law completely unenforceable. The most criminalized rock in English history didn't get decriminalized. It just got made irrelevant, replaced by something better, cheaper, and impossible to smuggle because there was nothing left worth stealing. Somewhere in a drawer near you, there's an object that used to be worth more than silver, guarded by soldiers, punished with exile, and fought over by governments, guilds, and a chemist who never got famous for solving the problem he solved. Next time you pick one up, you're holding the losing side of a war nobody remembers Britain fighting. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit the subscribe button, drop a like, and let us know in the comments what object you want us to uncover next. Every room you've ever walked into has a story. Next week, we'll tell it.